short run, firms have paid their fixed costs in order to be in an industry. But does this mean that they actually want to produce any output? Well, it depends. Economists call the decision regarding whether or not to produce any output in the short run the shutdown condition, and we can analyze this choice by comparing a firm's profit if it actually produces output to what that profit would be if it just shut down and didn't produce anything. So on the left here we have the mathematics of what profit would look like if we chose to actually produce stuff. And on the right here we have the mathematics of what profit would look like if we chose to not produce anything or to produce zero in the short run. So let's just go through these so we can start analyzing the trade-off. So if we produce, profit, as we saw before, is just equal to total revenue minus total cost. And we can say that total cost can be broken down into total fixed cost and total variable cost. So we can see that profit is just equal to total revenue minus the sum of our fixed and variable costs. If we were to just distribute our negative, we would get that profit is equal to total revenue minus total fixed cost minus total variable cost. And again, just applying some simple definitions regarding costs and revenues that we saw earlier, we can say that total revenue is just equal to price times quantity. Total fixed cost we'll just leave as total fixed cost. And we can say that total variable cost is just equal to average variable cost times quantity. And this just follows directly from the fact that average variable cost is equal to total variable cost divided by quantity. On the other hand, if we were to shut down and produce a quantity of zero, again, we can say that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. And for a while, everything looks pretty much the same. We break down total cost into total fixed cost and total variable cost, distribute our negative. But then, rather than breaking down total revenue into price times quantity and total variable cost into average variable cost times quantity, we simplify in a different way because we're not producing any output. So, if we're not producing any output, our quantity by definition is zero, so our total revenue is just zero. In the short run, we still incur these fixed costs because we say in the short run our fixed costs are unavoidable or sunk. We can't get them back even if we don't produce anything. So we're actually still incurring this cost here. On the other hand, because we're not producing anything, our variable costs are in fact zero. So we just see that our profit is equal to 0 minus total fixed cost minus 0, which just gives us negative total fixed cost. This shouldn't be entirely surprising because if you enter a market and then choose to not produce anything, you're basically out those fixed costs that you had to pay to get into that market in the first place. In order to decide whether or not we want to produce, what we ultimately want to do is we want to compare our profits if we do produce to our profits if we don't produce. So here we can say we want to produce if our profits from producing, which is just what I have here, is greater than or equal to the profits from not producing, which is just what I have here. Notice here that this greater than or equal to implies that if my profit is exactly the same from producing and not producing, I'm technically indifferent between the two options, but here I'm just implicitly assuming that if we're indifferent between the two options, we'll just say, we might as well produce. That's cool. So if we set up this condition here, the first thing that I notice is that there's a minus total fixed cost on both sides of the inequality. So if I were to then add total fixed costs to both sides of the inequality, these guys in fact just cancel out. And we're left with, we want to produce if our price times quantity minus our average variable cost times quantity is greater than or equal to 0. The implication of this comes back to this idea of sunk costs. We said in the short run, our fixed costs were sunk because we can't get them back no matter what we do, because we can't actually exit the industry. Here we're showing why this concept of sunk costs shouldn't be taken into account in our decision-making processes. Because the sunk costs are there regardless of what option we choose. So if they're unavoidable regardless of our course of action, then they become irrelevant in our decision-making process. Mathematically, we see that that's the case because they end up canceling out of this trade-off that we're analyzing here. So then we see, well, if we want to produce where price times quantity minus average variable cost times quantity is greater than or equal to 0, we can just factor out this Q, and then we can divide both sides by Q. Notice that doesn't affect this side because 0 divided by anything is just 0. And we can see that this condition simplifies to, we want to produce if price minus average variable cost is greater than or equal to 0, or stated a little bit more simply, we want to produce if our price is greater than or equal to our average variable cost. Now hopefully this makes some intuitive sense, because once we've paid our fixed costs to be in an industry, we're really asking the question, well, now that we've already done that, that's in the past and we can't do anything about it, is producing at least covering our variable cost of production? Or is it better to just sit here and do nothing rather than lose even more money by making stuff when we're not even covering our variable costs? If we put together the facts that in a competitive market, profit is maximized at the quantity where price is equal to marginal cost, and the fact that marginal cost intersects average variable cost at the minimum of average variable cost, we get an interesting result. Namely, that we want to produce if our price is at least as big as the minimum of our average variable cost curve, and we want to shut down if our price is less than the minimum of the average variable cost curve. So this gives us a pretty easy benchmark here. So we can see here, most average variable cost curves are U-shaped like this. And in fact, marginal cost hits right at the bottom here. So we can say that if our price is below the bottom of this U, then we want to shut down and we actually want to produce 0. And if our price is above the bottom of this average variable cost U, then we actually want to produce at the quantity where price is equal to marginal cost.